everyone. I'm Josipa, President and CEO of the Canadian Urban Transit Research and Innovation Consortium, and I'm delighted to welcome you back here today to day 2 of our first annual Smart Rail Technology Conference. Bonjour à tous, je suis Josipa Petrunic, président et directrice du Consortium de recherche et d'innovation en transport urbain au Canada. Je souhaite à tous et à toutes la bienvenue au 2e jour de notre toute première conférence canadienne sur la technologie ferroviaire intelligente. First and foremost, I would once again like to thank all Indigenous communities nationwide that span our national digital community, extending across the many lands and unceded territories of Canada, including the lands of the Iroquois Nation, where I stand here today and join you. Yesterday, we all heard about the need to move forward with electrified mass mobility via light rail transit, subways, streetcars, and interregional rail transit systems. We heard from SkyTrain, Via Rail, Metrolinx, what they're trying to do to move us forward as a rail nation in the 21st century, both regionally and nationally. And we heard from loads of other stakeholders that are trying to electrify and automate the entire system and network so that we can get to low-cost, efficient rail mobility and public transit networks that compete with the single passenger car in terms of cost and convenience for individuals and families. So that leaves open the question, what are our governments doing for us? And what have they done for us lately in rail mobility, transit networks, and better public transit overall? Comme vous le savez, le CUTRIC a un emprunt pan-canadien, et ce depuis 2015. Nous sommes fiers d'avoir à nos côtés des hommes et des femmes représentant le leadership québécois lors de notre conférence. Le Québec se positionne à l'avant-garde en matière d'électrification des transports et de développement de filières énergétiques stratégiques pour notre industrie, telle l'hydrogène vert. Depuis 2018, le gouvernement du Québec a partagé sa volonté claire d'électrifier l'économie de la province en investissant dans l'innovation. Qu'il s'agisse des investissements en transport collectif annoncés dans le plan pour une économie verte ou du développement de projets structurants électriques à travers la province, tels le REM, la ligne bleue ou le réseau structurant à Québec, le Québec est en très bonne posture pour assumer son rôle à l'échelle canadienne. So it's pretty obvious, Quebec is a leader, and it's a Canadian leader. It is paving a leadership pathway for the electrification of its entire mobility system and the build out of an innovative public transport network that moves people efficiently and in a climate-aware fashion, including by rail. As many of you know, CUTRIC has also been operating for the last 5 years out west in British Columbia since 2015. The newly elected government of British Columbia that just came into power in the last couple of weeks has said that it's also going to aim to generate jobs in the clean tech sector, where it's intending to spend billions of dollars in building a green recovery. So what does that mean? Well, the new Democratic Party made a provincial commitment during its campaign. First off, to complete the SkyTrain all the way into Langley, which is a big success for the mayor of Surrey, Doug McCallum, who pushed for the project to be changed to SkyTrain rather than LRT. So that is potentially a big win for the industry, depending on where you stand on that particular issue. The NDP platform also announced a recovery investment plan. The intention of that is to add about 1% of GDP, or about $3 billion per year, to the capital plans each year. That's a lot of money for a small portion of the Canadian population. British Columbia is not that big in terms of population. So that type of commitment could really move the needle in terms of infrastructure innovation that could well transform the landscape for light and heavy duty rail in that province, and at least for public transit systems and networks across the province. In Ontario, back over on the east side, the government's been doing pretty well as well. At least it's been very active. The province recently announced the Ontario Rebuilding and Recovery Act, which many of you will know is intended to accelerate several GO transit projects and is intended to advance transit-oriented communities. And that's all good. Ontario's also been working on the breakthrough and completion of the excavation on Tunnel 1 of 2 rail tunnels under highways 401 and 409. And the intention there is to transform the Kitchener GO line from a rush hour commuter service to a 2-way all-day rail service, which frankly, thank goodness for, because we're all looking forward to that, especially people like myself who do not have a car and who use rail to get around to meetings, to run my career, to advance CUTRIC, to grow business opportunities. I rely on rail. And so the completion of the Kitchener GO line will be able to benefit not just myself, but my family and the community that benefits from the work that CUTRIC does. The province also is moving forward with completing that tunneling work for the Scarborough Subway and the Eglinton Crosstown West Extension projects. And these are projects that, to be frank and fair, have annoyed a lot of us as Ontarians. They've exasperated us frequently in terms of the politics around those builds, but ultimately they've also inspired a lot of us to think about the potential for European-style subway connectivity across this great city. And if you live in Toronto, then you know full well how much these projects are needed. You know that people debate left, right, and center about whether it should be streetcars or buses or subways or LRT, but in reality, it just needs to be more. We need more transit, more rail, more mobility. Now, the federal government seems to have heard the message as well. It has declared that it wants to build a future made in Canada technologies that are recognized worldwide as leading products in the green tech sector. And that's great. One of the most obvious indications in that regard is the most recently announced piece of legislation by our Federal Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Jonathan Wilkinson, who just this past week, if you were watching the news, delivered his legislation, the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. And that's a really long name for a piece of legislation that says Canada must be net zero by 2050. This is really impressive. And it is true that if you watch the night news and you watch the panels and the power politics and the equivalents across CTV and CBC and CPAC and all the other news channels, there were just loads of pundits ready to criticize this legislation for having no punitive measures in it. But here's the reality. If you've been working in this industry, then you know how far this is compared to where we were all in 2010, when we were still trying to convince our federal representatives and legislators in Canada that climate change exists and that in this century, it is caused primarily by the overconsumption by human beings of cheap carbon. We're no longer having that discussion. And so this piece of legislation, despite the fact it doesn't have punitive measures, is just a brave new world of opportunity for those of us who have been working in the industry for the better part of our adult lives. Meanwhile, over the last half decade, I think it's fair to say, especially if you work in transit, you'll recognize that the Federal Public Transit Infrastructure Fund has pumped billions of dollars into the electrification of transit, into motivating garage overhauls, into microtransit, essentially. And while I don't have the quantitative number to share with you today, I am pretty sure that this is the most amount of investment in a short period of time by a federal government in transit in recent memory, certainly in my recent memory, and I'm 40 years old. So that goes back at least to the mid 1990s. So a great indication that Canada has some really important things to be proud of. Certainly in recent years, our federal and provincial governments no longer deny the need to act or address climate change immediately and dramatically. And they're putting money into transit projects and programs because that's what voters want and that's what voters are demanding. And the provinces with the biggest urban populations in the country and the most expansive rail networks already are pumping funds into different ways of electrifying transit or subway tunneling or overland rail expansions. And these are all really good things. But as Canadians, we have a long way to go. And that's because we're starting from a low point. Transit has been fundamentally underfunded in this country for years. There is still no workable rail network in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, the Maritimes, let alone the Northern Territories. And we know that congestion is pretty much clogging our cities. While we've gotten a little bit of a reprieve due to COVID-19, we all know that in a year's time, when many of us are hopefully vaccinated, congestion is going to come roaring back. We are going to have a congestion and smog and pollution nightmare because we already had a congestion and pollution and smog nightmare before COVID-19. If you live in downtown Toronto or downtown Montreal or downtown Vancouver, or even really today in downtown and that surrounding community of Calgary, you know how bad and how dirty the congestion is. If you're stuck behind the wheel of one of those cars, you know how aggravating it is because of the hours it consumes and what you would otherwise use for really leisure-wise or family-wise hours of your life. We also know that about a year from now, when hopefully again we're all vaccinated and we have ourselves and our families still fearing the potential for infection on public transit, if we're not investing in that sector today, that congestion, that smog is going to get exponentially worse. So we know that to avoid a congestion zoo and an urban pollution and smog nightmare, we know that we are going to have to invest very heavily in public transit and rail mobility systems starting now. Clean, hygienic, rapid, frequent, zero emissions, low cost, and connected rail and transit mobility. That's what we need. And that's what we're here to build. So to help us launch day 2 of this national event, it is my pleasure to introduce Walter Kinio, past chair of CUTRIC for 4 years running. Walter helped us to build and maintain a rail stream at CUTRIC. And through his leadership in rail technology innovation at Thales, as the Vice President of Research and Innovation at that company, he helped to spur a dialogue at CUTRIC about the need for driverless rail controls across his country to speed up and improve rail safety for Canadians and freight combined. Over to you, Walter.
How do you do? My name is Walter Kinio, and I was the founding vice chair of CUTRIC, serving between 2016 and 2019 in this dynamic organization. It's been amazing how CUTRIC has grown over the past 5 years, from its humble beginnings to over 100 members today, including suppliers, operators, utilities, nonprofits, and academic members. Rail innovation in Canada needs to be expedited. Too often we innovate, including solutions like driverless rail, but we don't use it here. We could help move people by mobility so much better than how rail operates today if these new technologies were integrated into our infrastructure plans. I strongly believe that a strong innovation ecosystem can have a significant benefit to our industry and country, not just for jobs, but for the environment as well. And this is a key goal of CUTRIC, to support innovation and to help us have a greener economy. You know, it was a belief in innovation by an earlier government that helped launch our own company in this country, and that's why we're a strong backer of this organization. New innovations in transit technologies can yield huge reductions in energy and CO2 emissions, and they can save transit operators a lot of money. Other new developments like autonomy and data analytics will also contribute to more reliable, flexible, and resilient rail and transit. I hope you enjoyed day 1 of the conference, which had some great topics and speakers, including our own Dr. Veronica Moran, who discussed the future of autonomy in the transit sector. Day 2 should also be very interesting, and it will include a keynote address by Mark Helinati, who's the head of our Canadian organization and who's been involved in the transit industry for many years. I really hope that you enjoy day 2 of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter, for your years of leadership at CUTRIC. Walter was on the board of directors of CUTRIC when we moved a motion to adopt a gender parity policy in 2016. Still to this day, CUTRIC is the only transit organization in Canada to have one. And as far as we know, we are the only technology consortium, the only tech startup, the only transit association across the entire nation to have a gender parity policy and to have over 50% of our board of directors as rigorously chosen, leadership-minded women. We have had more than 50% women on our board of directors since 2016, and we continue to lead in that space with natural organic leadership that's cropping up at organizations like TransLink and Burlington Transit and Hydrogenics and Cummins and Siemens and Hitachi ABB Power Grids and University of Windsor and BC Hydro, and the list goes on and on and on. Others have been represented on our board over the past half decade, and together and combined, it is why through that brain power, we have been able to do the controversial and dynamic things we have done, because we all know that diversity and experience leads to resilient thinking, better planning, and better business growth. Yes, we all know that, but living it and institutionalizing it are two different things. The rail industry in Canada is heavily male-led, and it's extraordinarily white, which makes it racialized in an uninspiring manner. It's not organic and it's not statistically sound. We also all know that. That is why it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce Maggie Walsh, past chair of Women in Transportation International and vice president of strategic pursuits at HDR, which I just think is one of the best career titles a person can ever have. I've had the pleasure to sit on a board of directors with Maggie for the past several years, and she knows my views, which is essentially that the lack of feminism in transit and in rail, indeed the lack of feminism in transportation in general, is hurting both women and men substantially today. For women, it's because we're excluded unjustly, and sociological case studies and statistics prove it out over and over and over. It's annoying and it's exhausting that we're not at the decision-making table deciding where tax dollars or private dollars should go and building out the infrastructure environments we live in that define the quality of our life and the ability to generate wealth for ourselves and our families. But we also know that increasingly for men, it's a problem. The lack of feminism in rail and public transit and mobility in Canada is hurting men. And it's hurting men because of the perception that comes with it. And we all know today that the perception is that if you are a man and you're racialized, in other words, you're white, so you come from what is perceived to be the most privileged class of human being on this planet today, the perception today is that there was a free pass at some point in your career, that you may not be in your position because you are the most talented or meritorious, but because the most talented and meritorious people were unjustly excluded from being able to compete with you when those positions came around. That perception is hurting male careers. And we know that unfortunately the statistics are feeding into it. In Canada today, over 90% of transit CEOs are white men. That's not statistically sound. It's not organic and it's not natural. The only way that that can exist is if there is discrimination in the system. There are too many people, too many women who have been graduating from universities for over 20 years in the majority of disciplines that universities graduate. So by now, statistically and organically, 50% of CEOs in transit should be women, and there should be a racial mix. The fact that that doesn't exist means the discrimination is embedded in the system. The potentially best meritorious, most talented people are not being allowed into the ring to compete. That hurts men. So we know that this is all of our problems. We are all part of the problem, and that means we all have to get active in generating a solution. Maggie has been on the front line of this issue. She's on the front line of feminism in transportation and has been for years. And her insights are keenly critical to this industry because she leads one of the most important rail projects in this country. Over to you, Maggie.
Women are smart, offer diverse perspectives, constantly upskilling their talents and knowledge. They are making a difference in the rail industry. Hello, everyone. I'm Maggie Walsh. I'm a vice president at HDR. I'm the immediate past chair of the board of directors for WTS International, and I'm the lead pursuit strategist behind HDR's multi-million-dollar award of the Ontario Line Technical Advisory Services contract. The Ontario Line is a 16-kilometer brand new standalone subway for the Greater Toronto Area. This is a flagship project for the province, and it will be a modern system using fully automated driverless technology. I'm happy to announce there are many top-notch women in leadership roles on this project. They're leading technical areas like track design, tunnel design, maintenance facilities, architecture, utilities, geotechnical, and more. I've been known to say that women are perfect candidates for leading large, complex projects. Why? Because they have spent their entire lives managing multiple demands and finding solutions for competing interests. This just doesn't seem to be enough, though. Today, we see many of the top leadership roles on rail programs like this one held by men. These men are smart, they're talented, they're doing a great job. Maybe it's because they were nurtured throughout their career and gaining the experience, building a strong resume. They've been positioned for the next opportunity. So a problem statement could sound like, we need to do more of this for women. I have an ask for all of you watching today. Find a female up-and-coming rising star and nurture her throughout her career. And if you just said, I'm already doing that, I challenge you to do more. Be intentional to help build her resume and give her the opportunity to be in that top leadership position on the org chart and take on those critically important roles. If she's a deputy today, find a way to promote her into that top manager role. This may need training, professional development, maybe even focused mentoring. Give her the room to build the experience so that when the opportunities for that big position comes along, there's not only a pool of great candidates, that pool is gender balanced of the best candidates. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today and to specifically be partnered with my friend and colleague Josipa. We are passionate and dedicated for partnering with our male allies to open as many doors as possible for women to walk through. This conference is packed with thought-provoking ideas, insight, and knowledge, and I hope you continue to participate.
In the interest of getting going with important and difficult discussions ahead today, I welcome you à tous et à toutes au deuxième journée to the second day of our National Smart Rail Technology Conference. Bienvenue and welcome.